Historically, countries that managed to develop their economies and rapidly lift millions out of poverty did so by building a strong manufacturing sector. Then, with manufacturing factories in place, people can be taken from agricultural fields, trained quickly, and placed on factory lines. The employment in factories increases their income multiple folds and lifts them out of poverty. We saw this in old developed countries and in more recently industrialized countries such as Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, just to name a few. All these countries went through rapid industrialization between the 1960s and 1990s and were able to maintain very high annual growth rates and lifted millions out of poverty along the way. Sadly, countries in Sub Saharan Africa did not experience the same manufacturing success, and the continent remains the least industrialized. And for several reasons, large institutional investors have mostly stayed away from the continent, thus creating a void that small investors like those in the diaspora can step in and fill. In this video, I talk about why manufacturing never took off in Africa and why there is an opportunity for Africans in the diaspora to step in and fill the gap. Welcome back to my channel. Before I get accused of generalizing, I want to make it clear that I am talking about the average and the trend across the continent. So I'll try to use words like some countries in Africa, or some African countries, or many countries in Africa, or many African countries, to stress the fact that there are exceptions. Of course there are. Now let's jump into it. The manufacturing sector in Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole makes up only 12% of total GDP, making the region the least industrialized in the world. In contrast, the manufacturing sector in East Asia and the Pacific contributes over 20% of total GDP. Because of the low industrialization rate, the majority of people in many African countries still live in rural areas and are self-employed in agriculture. They tend to be small, older farmers who cannot afford the machinery necessary to farm large plots of land and do not have access to improved seeds and animal breeds to increase their productivity. That means that they are forced to practice subsistence agriculture, which is designed to feed them and their families and not for commercial purposes, even if they might sell a portion of the harvest. But there is a change happening across the continent. Instead of an expansion of the manufacturing sector, what we see is an expansion of the services sector. We see rapid urbanization on the continent as people move from rural areas to the city, but with no factory jobs, they work in small service-oriented businesses such as restaurants or selling goods on the streets. And if they do get employment in, say, a restaurant, it tends to be informal employment, meaning that they are not declared to the proper authorities, so they do not have social security contributions such as retirement funds or unemployment insurance. But these jobs tend to be more productive than agriculture. And that is one of the reasons why we see a decline in the poverty rate, even if it's at a slow pace. Now, the million-dollar question remains: why did manufacturing and industrialization fail to take off in Sub-Saharan Africa? You see, for manufacturing to take off and expand, factories need a constant and uninterrupted supply of electricity to function. They need easy access to input and intermediary goods, either locally or by importing them. Either way, they need access
to a good network of transport infrastructure, such as roads, to get these inputs and intermediary goods to the factory. You also need a lot of healthy people who can be trained fairly quickly to work on factory lines. But before the factories can be put in place and for them to function well, there needs to be an effective bureaucracy to issue the necessary permits and registration in a timely fashion without bribery or patronage.
Now, how do African countries deal along these three aspects?
Most countries in Sub Saharan Africa have large and very young populations, which are still growing at a relatively rapid pace. So the number of people is not an issue. There is abundant labor to staff factories. But the main issues are the chronic lack of adequate physical infrastructure and inefficient bureaucracy. The roads and railway networks are limited and very old, in many cases dating back to colonial times. And because those were built by colonial powers, they were intended to link colonies under the same power. So they usually do not make sense in terms of the flow of goods. Take, for example, the only functioning red line in Burkina Faso, my home country, built by the French in colonial times. It links the capital Ouagadougou to Abidjan, the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, two former French colonies. However, the closest port to Ouagadougou is in Tema, Ghana, where most of Burkina Faso's export and import flow in and out of. Plus, electricity supply across the continent is not only spotty, but relatively expensive. Making things more complicated is the fact that corruption in the bureaucracy is pervasive in many countries on the continent. So it can take months to get all the necessary paperwork, and in many cases, you might pay bribes. This also makes it difficult to import intermediary goods.
All these challenges have contributed to holding back the development and expansion of the manufacturing sector in Sub-Saharan Africa. I know some people will be tempted to mention foreign powers, external powers conspiring to hold the African continent poor. But the fact of the matter is, companies and investors would go where the opportunities are and where the environment is conducive for investment. It is hard to deny that many African countries have pursued the wrong policies since independence and have failed for the most part to enact meaningful reforms. In recent years, countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania have shown us that with the right policies and right reforms, African countries can start to build a strong manufacturing base.
As a consequence of the limited industrialization, unemployment and poverty rates remain high. Countries across the continent do not produce enough and must resort to imports, even for food. Primary goods that are produced are not transformed on the continent. African governments struggle to provide critical services such as education and healthcare. And because of the fast-growing population, these gaps will only grow larger with time if productions are not increased fast enough. But because the fundamentals are still not there, large investors or institutional investors will likely continue to stay away from African countries.
This means that there is a void that small investors can step in and fill. And this is where the African diaspora comes in.
For example, the diaspora can invest in farming to fill the food deficit. They can invest in waste management, which is critically needed in urban areas across the continent. They can also provide education services such as after-school tutoring.
This is just to name a few. In particular, I think the African diaspora has two main advantages.
One, those in the diaspora have more opportunities to save. This is probably the biggest advantage in my opinion. By some estimates, the African diaspora saves over $50 billion annually. A small fraction of that invested on the continent would make a difference. On the other hand, entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan African countries do not have easy access to financing for many reasons. And when they do have access to financing, the cost of borrowing is very high.
Two, those in the diaspora have easier access to information.
Entrepreneurs on the continent have limited access to information about cheap and effective technology and innovations. One reason might be the high cost of internet connection.
So there is clearly a role for us in the diaspora to play, a void for us to fill. But the risks are not small, so the probability of failure is also high. But the return and the impact would be substantial if we are successful. So we should at least try, or should I say, at least some of us should try. And that is why I have decided to try. Now, to increase the probability that we succeed in starting small, productive, formal enterprises, I think we must dwell on three things. One, innovation. This should be the primary driver of the enterprises we invest in. How do we innovate to enhance productivity? Innovation in terms of production and in terms of management. And this doesn't have to be high-tech, just different approaches and all small machines that can help to increase efficiency. Two, formalization and creation of quality jobs. Let's not start informal enterprises. We must declare our enterprises to the proper authorities and hire people formally, even if it's a lot of headache and it's complicated. And this is important because informal enterprises tend to remain small and are not very productive. And formalizing their employment would motivate the workers to work harder. Three is learning and training. Ignoring this will break the enterprises that we invest in. So we must make sure that the people that we hire are well trained and that they develop both the hard skills necessary for the activities of the enterprise, but also soft skills such as communication, time management, personal finance, and interpersonal skills. That being said, I know there are many of you out there in the diaspora who have invested in your home countries. So I would really love for us to build a community and to share our experience with each other. So if you are in the diaspora and have invested in your home country on the continent, please reach out to me or leave a comment below about what you have done that has worked for you and what are some of the challenges and the lessons you've learned along the way. If you have not subscribed yet, please do so and smash that like button for the algorithm. And thank you very much for watching this video and see you in my next video. So long.